Ok, signori, mi sentite?
Sì.
Bene, allora ce l'ho fatta, è stata dura ma ce l'ho fatta. Ho convertito il documento in PDF. Ok, let's go back to our modeling. We shall start by describe a top-down approach, going for more from very complex systems models, like for example, metabolic models. So we are now describing the flows of energy inside an animal in order to model the effect or the life performance of this animal. We are going to compose this only in energetic flows. So in this sense, this is a top-down approach, meaning that we start from a general principle that is, as always, the principle of conservation of energy, and then we try to detail the single flows through which the energy is transformed and transported into the system. In particular, this type of approach is good for modeling fish growth. So these models, these are models that are good for higher trophic levels. We start by observing that fish feeds on algae and or zooplankton. So fish are considered, if primary production is the first trophic level, when zooplankton and microcrustaceans is the second trophic level, then fishes are feeding on the third trophic level. So, fishes are feeding on the second trophic level, so they pertain to the third trophic level. We recognize immediately that growth depends on specific species-specific characteristics and some environmental factors. Species-specifics, like for example the age. At different ages, for example, animals consume different levels of energies, but also environmental conditions like environmental temperature has a strong influence on the way the energy is distributed into the system. Other characteristics like variation of food ingested or the body size are things that have to be taken into account in order to describe energy flows. Historically, fish growth models are based on empirical models. The classical empirical models you may have ever heard already of are, for example, the logistic models with Gompertz, von Bertalanffy, Richards, and so on. All these models are built on the basis of a best fit, so parameter, in this case, do not have a precise meaning. Instead, parameters are calibrated in terms of experimental data. In particular, we may immediately notice that the typical outcome of a population versus time model in this perspective is the logistic growth curve, or if you want, sigmoidal curve in general terms. That is the general curve that describes limited growth. We have already said that unlimited growth is an ecological nonsense, so the only growth that we shall take into consideration is limited growth. Let's see how we can build a model of limited growth that brings out in a sigmoidal curve. What are the factors affecting growth? There are two broad categories, intrinsic and extrinsic factors. Intrinsic factors are like species, the race, the dimension of the animal, the swimming activity, the levels of maturity, the age at which maturity is reached, and so on. Extrinsic factors are factors referred to the surrounding environment and are abiotic or biotic. The abiotic, photoperiod, temperature, oxygen content, other conditions like pH or presence of toxic substances or presence of salinity, for species that are sensible to salinity and light intensity. The other biotic factors that are extrinsic biotic factors are diet, ration, feeding frequency, parental care, and diseases of the social hierarchy. So into the category of extrinsic biotic factor falls all a set of characteristics that has to do with the way this organism organizes its life in populations. So it has to do with population dynamics or population biology. How do we build the metabolic growth model? Classically, we start by describing the fate of consumed food. We decide that we may employ currency in terms of mass or energy. In general, we employ energy. For example, if we say that C is the quantity, sorry, let me see if I have a possibility. Oops. Okay, if C is the quantity of consumed food, then of this quantity of consumed food, a portion is immediately lost into feces. What it is not lost, it is assimilated material. Of assimilated material, we have immediately two expensive. One is called the specific dynamic action, or SDA. So it is the energy used for the digestion, so for converting what has been assimilated into energy, consumable energy. And another part is immediately lost through urine by excretions or gills, skin, transpiration, and so on. What it remains we have what is called metabolizable material, so a material that may be transformed into biomass. Of this material, a part is immediately consumed as a respiration or other activities like swimming, hunting, and so on. This is the so-called basal, the so-called specific dynamics or action material, action energy consumed. A part is employed for what is called basal metabolism, so the energy, the minimum level of energy needed to maintain an organism alive, like for example for respiration or for heart beating and so on. So for temperature control, and the difference between all of this energy is what it grows in new biomass, what we will call growth. If we use this kind of representation, then by simple energy balance equations, we may write a first equation that tells us that, that the biomass or the growth, the biomass produced is equal to what has been consumed in terms of ingested food C minus what it has been spent for various activities. A big F, it is what has been spent for feeding, or what has been losses through urines, or what has been losses through respiration activities, including basal metabolism, specific dynamic action, and other activities. So we have these two equations. The first equation is an energy balance equation. The second equation is the composition of all respiration elements. So it is, as always, the same old story: energy conservation, what goes in minus what goes out due to various effects. And then what we may write in terms of a general model, we may write that the anabolism, or anabolism is the energy that has been transformed into new biomass, what we may call growth. Anabolism is equal to metabolism, that is the energy consumed per unit time, per unit volume by an organism, minus catabolism, that is the basal energy employed by the organism to survive. As always, we have we may write a fish growth equation. If we indicate with W the weight of a fish, we may write that the variation in time of the weight of a fish is equal to something that goes in minus something that goes out. So ingestion plus consumption, if you want. W may be expressed in dry weight, indicating DW, or in wet weight, WW. The assumption here is the first key assumption that we are employing is that ingested food, what goes in, and the fishes themselves have approximately the same chemical composition. So a basic idea is that we are what we eat. Essentially, the biomass that we produce has the same composition of the food. This we have already discussed this assumption. This has to do with the fixed stoichiometry principle or with the red fill ratio numerical. So, given that all the biomasses, all biochemical molecules have more or less the same composition or the same structure, we may write that anabolisms it is equal to metabolism, so what it is going into growth, minus the energy that has been consumed. We may write this equation that the variation in terms of the weight of fish is equal what goes in minus what goes out. And if we start formalizing this model into a mathematical formalization, we may write that the variation in time of the weight of a fish is equal to what goes in minus what goes out. What goes in we may indicate with CT, the quantity of ingested food. So CDT is equal to a coefficient F that may be called feeding level. So how much the animal is feeding. And another constant H. And we may say that the ingested food, CDT, is proportional to some power of the weight of the fish. And what we are writing here, what we are writing here is that what an organism can ingest or can put into his mouth is somehow proportional to its sum of one dimension of its dimension. For example, we may employ the weight as a dimension. So it is proportional to a power m to the weight of the fish itself through a couple of constants. The first constant is the feeding level goes, all these constants are in the range 0, 1, so the feeding level goes from 0 to 1. A fish that is starving has a feeding level of 0, and a fish that is eating all you can eat has a feeding level of 1. The idea of putting a proportional to a weight of a fish has to do with the fact that the food absorbing surface in the intestine is proved to be a function of the weight of the fish itself. These are all allometric principles, as we have seen in the preceding lectures, allometric principles linking characteristics of organisms through several orders of magnitude. So these are general principles that allows us to say that, for example, quantity of ingested food, CDT, is proportional to the weight of the fish. We may go on, and now we may try to express or to explicitate the energy in terms of weight of the fish expended by the fish for the fasting activity. So this is the fasting catabolism. So this is a fish that is not eating or is starving. So we may write the fasting catabolism, so the energy spent per unit time per unit fishes of a starving fish is again proportional to one dimensions indicating one of the indicators of the dimension of the animals. For example, again, the weight of the animals to a different proportion and exponent n. So K in this case is called the coefficient of fasting catabolism. We have experiments on respiration that justify this kind of assumption. Experiments on respiration allows us to demonstrate that the fasting catabolism, so the energy spent by a fish or by an animal that is not feeding, is proportional to the weight of the animals to different proportions. Again, we shall now explicitate the energy consumed by a feeding fish. So if we indicate with CDT the ingested food of this quantity, a reduction amount beta times CDT is that the fraction that has been actually taken of the food consumed, so that fraction of the food consumed that undergoes actually through the process of digestion. In this case, then we may explicitate the catabolism of specific dynamic action or the energy consumed by a feeding organism by multiplying alpha, the fraction of food intake used for the activity of digestion. You may recall we have indicated quota of ingested food, CDT, when we indicate the energy of a fasting organism. Then we explicitate the energy for feeding. So of the ingested food, we reduce the ingested food by quota beta. It is the fraction actually taken of the food consumed. Of this, we reduce this quantity by the fraction of food intake that is used for the activity of digestion. So this fraction of the food that actually undergoes the chain of metabolic transformation that convert food into energy, of this energy we reduce it, the quantity, by the fraction that is taken or employed to make this conversion, and then we are left with the estimation of a non-digested, but once we have reduced the fraction actually taken of the food consumed by coefficient beta, given that these coefficients are all in the range of 0, 1, the fraction of non-digested may be indicated as 1 minus beta times the quantity of ingested food, CDT. I hope this is quite clear. There is nothing particularly exotic in this deduction. These are simply a systematic deduction that starts from the assumption that we are what we eat, so ingested food has the same composition of the material or organic matter that makes up the organism. The second assumption is that the surface of the organism's absorbing surface, so the food absorbing surface of the organism or the surface of the intestine is proportional to one dimension of the fish. Then we include the fact that the energy consumed by the organism for performing living activities is proportional to the weight of the organism, to a different power. If we put all these together, when we rewrite our metabolic growth model in this way, indicated that ingested food minus what is consumed by a fasting fish, non-eating fish, what it is consumed in terms of energy for the activity of feeding, and what it is consumed in terms of energy by non-digested or throwouts of the foods. If we put all these together, we end up with this kind of model This is a very peculiar model, but not so particular, because we have two indications again: a positive contribution, but depends. So the variation of the weight of fish is equal to a positive contribution, but depends on the weight of a fish to a power m, and minus a negative contribution, but depends again to the weight of a fish through a power n this time. And if alpha, beta, f, and h are at least approximately constant, then we may rewrite this equation by saying that the variation in time of the weight of a fish is equal to a positive contribution through a constant h. Constant h is calculated by assembling all these constants, minus a negative contribution through a constant k, and a dependency on different powers of the weight. What are these kind of equations? These are nth or mth order, these are first order non-linear differential equation. Non-linear if m and n are different from 1 or from 0, from 1. The nonlinearity is due to the fact that the variation in time of the weight of fish depends on the weight of the fish itself. Sorry, let me clean out. Okay. So we end up by studying the flow, the fate of the food taken by an organism. We ended up on a very general model that is a nonlinear first order in time derivatives, but describes the growth of the organisms. This model, if you plot this model, you may have two different shapes. Once m is larger, is smaller than n, but means that the organism, the positive contribution to the model is larger than the negative contribution. So the limiting effect is smaller than the growing effect. In this case, you have a sigmoidal curve with an asymptotic behavior. So if time goes to infinity, then the weight of a fish tends to its asymptotic weight, which is w to infinity. If, on the other hand, the exponent of growing of a positive contribution m is larger than the exponent of a negative contribution, you have an hyperbolic description, an hyperbolic growth model. As we said several times, these kind of models are not really ecologically significant because unlimited growth is, as we said, an ecological nonsense. So the only true growth that you may expect to find in real ecosystems are limited growth. So this makes up the fact that this kind of representation gives us two point of view. One is this one is referring to the whole time span of the life of the animals. In this case, you have a exponential growth, until you reach an inflection point. In this point, of course, you may recall the second order derivative is 0. So you have a changement of concavity of the function. And then by this changement of concavity, the function tends to a limiting or asymptotic value, that is W infinite. In the early growing stages, instead, you may employ this representation, which is the representation in which the positive contribution to growth is larger than the negative contribution. From this model, you may define two different values, W infinity, that is the asymptotic weight, and W inflection, that is the maximum growth rate. So the point at which you have the inflection point, it is the point at which the growth rate is maximum. This means that once you have crossed this point of inflection, the growth rate tends to slow down. You may recall we have seen already these kind of models when we studied the enzymatic reaction, chemical reaction enzymatic models. We said that in this case we applied the Monod equation. The Monod equation in order to describe asymptotic growth. This is a general formulation of the model we have just seen. Sorry. Anabolism equal to metabolism minus catabolism. The representation, if beta is equal to 1, is the one you have seen. So you have a growth that increases until a maximum. So this is the growth rate, the speed of growth increases until you reach the maximum when the speed of growth decreases. So this is the typical saturation behavior sigmoidal curve or Michaelis-Menten approach. You may recall that the approach is exactly the same. There is a special case we have already cited here and there. The special case it is the model of von Bertalanffy. Von Bertalanffy, in this case, the second exponent m, so the exponent of limiting effect is 1, while you leave free the first exponent n. Typically, if there are indications that the first exponent should fall in the range 2/3 1, so all these numbers are in the interval 0, 1 in particular, we have indication that if there is a balance between the supply consumption, so needs of supply and needs of consumption are balanced in your network, then the exponent of this model should be found into the range 2/3 1. Remember, the assumption is that the catabolism is proportional to the weight, the area of intestine, or the area of the food absorbing surface is proportional to the weight as well. In particular, with the von Bertalanffy assumption, we see that the area of the intestine should be proportional to the body weight elevated to a 2/3 exponent. The 2/3 exponent may be justified by some kind of topological analysis or studies. So this has to do with the ratio between surface and volume of solids. Okay, so the metabolic growth rate model from von Bertalanffy tells us that from some kind of topological constraints, it has to do with the structure of the network, the exponent in the metabolic growth model should be contained in the interval 2/3 and 3/4. I recall you 2/3 surface divided by volume, 3/4 is 1 dimension plus volume divided by a 4-dimensional description or dimension of the organism. Now let's resume what we have seen between models for population growth. We have started by introducing the linear growth, variation in time of a quantity describing the dimension of the organism. Excuse me. Equal to a constant c. Then we have seen the Malthusian exponential growth. In this case, we have seen that the variation in time of quantity described in the dimension of the organism is proportional to the quantity itself. We have seen that this kind of assumption drives us toward an exponential growth model. So the solution is the solution we have indicated here. Or we have seen the logistic growth model in which we include a limiting effect, so negative limiting effect to growth. In this case, we have a dependence to a power one of a dimension minus a dependence to the power 2, so this is an x squared. And this is the very general equation of a limited growth or logistic growth. When I'm asking you what is the only true model of limited growth, your answer is the logistic growth model, but has two contributions, a positive one, but has to do, it is proportional to the, it is a linear, and a negative one, but is proportional to the square of a variable. In these cases, the maximum growth rate is always obtained when we are at the inflection point, but is exactly halfway to the maximum k divided by 2. All these models are represented by sigmoidal curves. The very general description of a sigmoidal group, mathematical formalization of a sigmoidal curve, is the one I'm reporting here. So x at times t is equal to a divided by 1 plus a function, what is a generic function of the growth rate. Anyhow, this is a flow, a bundle of curves, all passing through the inflection point. And you may introduce several variations to this kind of models. For example, one interesting variation is the Gompertz model, in which we are trying to include the limiting effect by assuming that the mortality grows exponentially with the number of organisms in the population. In this case, what you're doing, you are including a second differential equation, while the first differential equation, the variable is the number indicating the dimension of a population, in this case x. In the second differential equation, you make a dependence of growth parameter r on time, and you make this dependence as a negative exponential. So what you are including here as an effect is the effect of the fact that mortality grows exponentially with population size. For historical reasons, another important model that is derived from the logistic is the logistic with delay model. In this case, the assumption is that the organism has to reach a reproductive maturity that we may indicate by Tm. In this case, we write with the variation in time of the size of a population is equal to intrinsic growth rate R multiplied by the dimension of a population X at T multiplied by 1 minus X time at time T minus the reproductive maturity interval. The effect is that of having a sigmoidal growing curve in which you have an oscillation that is damping around the asymptotic behavior of the asymptotic weight of the population. But in this case, is called, you may recall, we have called this quantitative carrying capacity of the system for a population. All these effects are obtained by modeling bacterial batches. So if you include into a bacterial batch, for example, a bacterial strain that needs some time to reach reproductive maturity, you'd better employ not a simple logistic, but a logistic with delay representation that takes into account the effect that not all the organisms are ready at the same time to reproduce themselves. This is quite representative of the physiology of bacteria, as you know, that these kind of very simple cells divide when they reach a specific age. So, interesting point here is that you have damping oscillation around the carrying capacity until the carrying capacity is reached and the system stops. Okay. Note that the model that we have discussed here may be employed for describing the metabolic growth of a single animal, let's say a fish, but also the metabolic growth of a population of fishes. In particular, these kind of models are very useful when you deal with aquaculture systems. In this case, this model gives you clear guidance on when is the time to gather your yield from your aquaculture system. So when it's time to leave away, to take away fishes from the pond and put them on the market. And if you look at the shape of the curves, we said that the maximum growth rate is reached at the inflection points. So when the curve changes its concavity. In this case, we may say that the speed of growth of the population is the maximum. This means that after this point, if you are putting feed into your aquapound system, you are wasting food. So in terms of economic convenience, the point at which you will sell your animals from the pond is the point in which your animals reach the maximum growth rate. After that, they can only slow down their growth rate until they reach the carrying capacity saturation point. Okay, from now on, we stop here. I recall you that from the next week, we will start MATLAB classes. I hope that you are all comfortable with the MATLAB package that you have been able to install onto your computers, because from next week, it will be Alberto Barause that will take over me and will guide you through the building of the first ecological model in a MATLAB environment. Next week, we will finish the processes by discussing biological processes. In particular, I will introduce photosynthesis model and population growth model, but is a more general model, or let's say algae growth model, that is the more general model that we will study in this class, and that is the model that you are supposed to learn and to know and to explain to me when I will test your marks by examinations. Okay, if you have any questions, I stay here for 5-10 minutes and then I close the classroom. Bye bye.